All right, everybody. Thank you so much. We're running a little bit behind, but we're going to get started for our second segment for the Nichi Bei Book Fest. So welcome everybody who wasn't here this morning. My name is Koji Laozawa. I'm a board member of the Nichi Bei Foundation and an archaeologist and historian of Japanese American history. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our second section, Rediscovering the Unknown. And we're going to start by highlighting a new book by Greg Robinson with Jonathan Van Harmelen, The Unknown Great, Stories of Japanese Americans at the Margins of History. Greg Robinson is a professor of history at the University of Quebec in Montreal, Canada, researching ethnic studies in U.S. political history. He's a regular contributor to the Nichi Bei News and is the author of many books. I couldn't include them all, Greg, but it includes By Order of the President, A Tragedy of Democracy, After Camp, The Unsung Great, and The Great Unknown. And also here with us in person, Greg is on screen. The large image on the wall is in person is Jonathan Van Harmelen, who recently received a PhD in history from the University of Santa Cruz and is currently a lecturer at UC Santa Cruz. He focuses on U.S. political history and Asian American history, and his dissertation focused on the role of Congress in the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Jonathan is also a contributor to the Nichi Bei News, Discover Nikkei, and Densho. So please welcome Greg Robinson and Jonathan Van Harmelen. So we're going to start off. I think Jonathan and Greg are going to read a little bit from their introduction, so I'll hand the mic over to you, Jonathan.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Koji, for the introduction. I'm going to read a little bit of something I wrote just before and then get into my opening remarks from the foreword to The Unknown Great. So first, of course, I want to thank Kenji Taguma for inviting Greg and myself to talk about The Unknown Great with everyone here. We're, of course, big fans of Nichi Bei. Of course, Greg having been a longtime contributor, and Kenji's been very gracious in allowing me to contribute a few pieces here and there, especially in the past year, and I'm very excited to be helping out here. So, Greg and I are working on a piece, and it's about my 100th article for Discover Nikkei, and so it's kind of talking about this path of my path in terms of journalism and historical writing for the public, which parallels in some ways Greg's own path as well. So I just want to talk about, there's many starting points for The Unknown Great. One is when Greg invited me to collaborate on a Discover Nikkei piece in March 2019 about a Catholic priest that was from Los Angeles who was with the Maryknoll group and was very much an active supporter of the Japanese American community throughout incarceration. That piece you'll find in The Unsung Great, which is for sale in the back over there. But more broadly, it was the beginning of a long collaboration that we've had since 2019. What you'll find in The Unknown Great is several of our pieces that were written primarily during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a time in the spring around April 2020 where we started working on several pieces. And then from June through August, we almost wrote about 2 to 3 pieces a month for the Nichi Bei. And many of those pieces you'll find in the music section of The Unknown Great, where we uncover and discuss all these fascinating and important musicians, singers, orchestra leaders that all had their impact not just on Japanese American history, but even greater U.S. music history. And I'll get to those points in a second. So one thing I want to emphasize with the many roots of this book is beyond just 2019, 2020, is this book was born out of the pandemic, but it's also born out of the idea of not just writing for academic audiences, but bridging academic and public audiences with our writing, and starting with, of course, the Nichi Bei and Discover Nikkei, and then finally bringing it together into a book, which Greg will talk about in a bit as being a general counterhistory. So with that said, I'm going to read a brief segment of my note or my preface to The Unknown Great to give you a greater idea about the book and what it has to offer readers. For me, a unique feature of The Unknown Great is how it expresses the partnership that Greg and I have built over the last few years. Not only does the book include a section of our joint columns, but Greg insists that even his solo writing bears a certain stamp of our discussions, as he and I have developed the practice of proofreading and commenting on each other's drafts before publication. Still, it is the co-authored pieces that stand out most highly for me. The special beauty of our collaboration, as we have learned, not only lies in our mutual interests in the subjects we write about, but also in how we together draw inspiration from our different backgrounds. Perhaps the best example of this is our section on Japanese American musicians. Greg, a devout listener of opera and a specialist in African American history, suggested that we spotlight singers Mariko Mukai Endo and Ruby Yoshino, two talented singers who wielded their stardom as a tool for civil rights advocacy. As a classical percussionist, I found in Yoichi Hiraoka two stories that spoke to me. First, that of a performer who used his musical talent to bridge the cultural gap between Japan and the United States, and second, as an innovative percussionist who transformed the marimba and xylophone into centerpieces of orchestral performance. And very few, I think, appreciate how much of an impact that Yoichi Hiraoka had on classical music as well, and that's what really inspired me about the piece. In the case of Kenjiro Matsudara, we both drew from our knowledge of Meiji Japan and Washington, D.C. I did my master's at Georgetown, and I worked at the National Museum of American History for a bit, and so I enjoyed living in D.C., and that's what drew me to writing about Matsudara. To understand how a former circus performer came to be elected as mayor of Edmondson, Maryland, which is on the outskirts of the city. In each case, we sought to uncover stories about Japanese Americans that defied traditional narratives of race and immigration and challenge our assumptions about United States history. Beyond our co-authored pieces, Greg's articles reprinted in The Unknown Great add a new twist to the existing historiography on Japanese Americans. Beyond being enjoyable in its own right, each section either sets the groundwork for future research or complements new trends in Japanese American history. The sections dedicated to interracial coalition building, for example, and queer history are invaluable resources for future scholarship on Japanese American activities in activism and in sexuality studies. Chapter 5 offers enlightening stories about religious leaders from across the United States, or in Toehiko Kagawa's case, around the globe, who mobilized to support Japanese Americans amid difficult times. Like Duncan Ricken Williams and Emily Anderson's recent exhibit and book for the Japanese American National Museum, Sutra and Bible, it forms part of a new and transformative wave of scholarship on religion and Japanese Americans. The Unknown Great, as Greg reminds us, is not to be seen as definitive, rather it is the beginning of something new. For any historian, the greatest honor they can receive is the knowledge that their work inspires others. I hope that you enjoy the stories as I have and are inspired by them to see Japanese American history in a new way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Greg, if you want to, I think, add a few words of your own.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I would say I'm glad to welcome readers to The Unknown Great. It's my third collection of short pieces to be published. As with its two predecessors, the book is made up of sketches, readable and fun stories of unheralded figures in Japanese American history. Yet beyond being entertaining, as if that wasn't enough, my sketches have a serious purpose. By focusing on exceptional people and things, they challenge stereotypes of Japanese Americans in popular culture as colorless and suggest the diversity of the group's experience. Indeed, even more than in my previous work, The Unknown Great offers a radically different account of the history of ethnic Japanese in the United States. Really, it's a counter-history of Japanese Americans that challenges existing stereotypes and underlines the cosmopolitan nature of their experience. Now, the dictionary defines cosmopolitan as either having wide international sophistication or composed of persons from all or many parts of the world. So what these sketches show is, first, from the outset, Japanese communities in North America not only comprised people from another continent, Japan, of course, but included many who had spent time in nations such as Hawaii, which was an independent nation then, Canada and Latin America before settling in the United States. The community was made up of a diverse set of people, including those from Okinawa, ethnic Koreans, Burakumin, that is Japanese untouchables, and their children and grandchildren were an even more far-flung group whose members migrated to different areas of North America or went to live in Europe or Asia, particularly the Japanese Empire. One of the more fun chapters of The Unknown Great is that which focuses on Japanese Americans in Europe, and particularly in France. As for being sophisticated, a visible fraction of the immigrants, especially those who settled in New York and Chicago, were business people and artists. They felt at home in the larger society and were able to mix more or less freely with white associates. And a lot of them were of mixed ancestry. And that is, the Issei were in mixed marriages and the Nisei children were mixed race. Even those in West Coast communities were exposed to other cultures and drew from elements of Western and Asian civilizations in their lives. Issei immigrant women in particular were on average far more educated than their white counterparts. They were passionate readers, wrote diaries in their limited free time, and composed poetry. So the real-life counterpart of Hisai Yamamoto's 17 syllables, which Emiko has so memorably made into a film, is these women who participated in poetry contests. They encouraged their children to study and to develop intellectually and culturally. As a result, the Nisei generation, in turn, would boast a stunning proportion of writers, artists, and musicians, as well as consumers of books, films, and jazz or classical music. What's more, The Unknown Great stands apart from the historical literature in its focus on new and undiscovered themes within the Nikkei experience. There are marginal areas, not only in being less documented, but also difficult and sometimes uncomfortable to unravel. They involve sensitive and even taboo subjects, such as interracial relationships, sexuality, religious faith, and national identity. For example, a central part of the book is devoted to understanding the longstanding interactions between African Americans and Japanese Americans. One particularly important area that is explored here is the collaboration forged among individual Black artists, writers, and activists and their ethnic Japanese allies. I also explored the diverse nature of representations of African Americans in Nikkei art and literature. For example, Brian Mia and I do a 4-part series on coverage of African American characters in Japanese American literature. At the same time, The Unknown Great gives a complex presentation of Japanese American sexuality and family structures. Historians have generally assumed, as we said, that mixed-race Japanese white couples and their Hapa descendants were exceptional and unwelcome within Nikkei society. In fact, early Japanese communities, notably outside the West Coast, included numerous people of mixed ancestry who comprised a significant fraction of the group's writers, artists, and performers. In broader terms, conventional narratives of Japanese American history focus on nuclear family groups and pass over the Issei bachelors with their largely same-sex domestic arrangements and other unmarried people who long comprised a significant share of the group's population. Indeed, in regard to sexuality, perhaps the most strikingly original aspect of The Unknown Great is its exploration of the queer history of Japanese Americans. This area can well be described as the black hole of Japanese American life because of the stigmatized nature of the subject and the difficulty of finding and interpreting source material. Yet LGBTQ plus people have always been present within Japanese communities, and their hidden past richly deserves rediscovery. Here, my book adds to the small volume of existing literature on the queer history of Japanese Americans by such authors as Amy Tsuyoshi, Andrew Young, John Howard, Eric Watt, and others. In general, the book is, as Jonathan said, not intended to be definitive. I'm scratching the surface of a number of new areas, and I'll be very happy if further research shows that I've been wrong in some areas, wrong in some, not too many. In any case, it's an invitation to historians to reflect further and to just community members, insiders and outsiders alike, to consider in broader context the history of Japanese Americans. Thank you.
Thank you to Greg and Jonathan for those introductions to your book. So starting off the conversation, you both mentioned in these forwards and introductions that you hope this book will inspire researchers to move in new directions in Japanese American history. And I'm just curious, how did you pick these topics that you focused on throughout the book? There are these thematic chapters. Were they things that you were intentional about, sort of writing about as you developed the initial articles that went into the book, or did they sort of emerge organically as you were looking back over the work that you had written that you were preparing for this volume?
Well, it's sort of yes and no answer in the sense that the columns themselves, which is where this started, were random in the sense that I pursued columns on things that interested me. With one exception, there was an annual Nichi Bei queer history column that I have written at the kind invitation of Kenji for many years, and so I have a natural outlet for that in my discussion of queer history. But in general, the chapter sections were fairly randomly started as individual entries But then when it came time to make a book, Jonathan and I decided what it would be best to, which categories would be the most fruitful for putting in. For example, as Jonathan mentions, we both wrote a lot together about music. And so it seemed logical to have an entire chapter on music.
And to follow up on that, part of it is it came out a lot organically. I mean, of course, I think talking about Greg's background, not just as a Japanese American historian, but African American historian as well, that there's a lot of this background inspiration where we're going through a lot of archival materials, especially the newspaper records, and seeing all these different stories that just come up. And sometimes we just have this tendency where we're going through back issues of the Nichi Bei or the Rafu Shimpo, all the way from the 30s through the 60s, and just seeing these stories that pick our interest. Like there's a story about, like again with Yoichi Hiraoka, or you'll see his name come up here and there, or Ruby Yoshino, where you see all these different archival photos of her giving these performances at, for example, for wounded veterans in different hospitals, and doing these different rounds or these different tours with Dr. Titi Yatabe in the Midwest to help with resettlement. But more than just for Japanese Americans, that you see her activism coming up in different ways. And so just seeing that initially we are going through and we just find an individual and then we just pick that thread and then we just follow through with it. And at a certain point we realize we have, or certainly a lot in Greg's case, that there's an amassed amount of information where we can form these different themes. But in the case of music, and I want to say early 2020, we had already dedicated an idea to doing a music column or a series of articles on music where we would find information on one performing artist and then more information would come up because the artists would perform with each other sometimes. Especially, it's rich to see the history of the 30s here in cities like San Francisco or the broader Bay Area, where you see all these different singers like Ruby Yoshino who are performing like at the local YBA or the Christian organizations, and they're performing alongside a lot of these other musicians as well. So you can just look at the list of names that you see like in a choir performance, and then you say, oh, where'd this person go? Where'd this person go? Or we find in other cases, like Maruko Mukai, who was from Seattle. Her father had this huge case in the Claims Act where they filed a claim for their property in Seattle, and it's like, oh, here's this connection too. So, I mean, sometimes it's whimsical, but sometimes we're trying to look for those stories I think are kind of absent from the historiography.
Thank you. And sort of following up on that, you know, I think as you both have mentioned, music plays such a large role in the book and the chapter on music, but even outside of that, it appears in many of the other chapters as you talk about musician and the role of music in the Japanese American community. There's been some writing on music. I'm thinking of George Hashida's Reminiscing in Swing Time and the role of jazz, particularly in the pre-war Japanese American community. But I think what was really stunning and really interesting was the breadth of styles of music that you talk about in the book. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about both the role of music in your life as authors that sort of drew you to the subject, and what was the importance to the music to the Japanese American community in this time period, and all these different avenues from opera to classical to xylophone to jazz, just the sort of ranges of ways that Japanese Americans got involved, and it provided different opportunities and avenues for careers in the United States and outside of the United States and Europe as well.
You want me to go first, Greg, on this, or?
Yes, please do.
Well, in terms of personal inspiration for myself, as I mentioned, I'm a classical percussionist. I haven't been part of an orchestra in a few years since COVID, but I've previously performed in different college orchestras, in Pomona College in Georgetown and other places. And music for me has always just been a current in my life that I've always appreciated. And music history, I think, is always fascinating because you're not just talking about the way music is performed, the different styles or genres that come up, but also how music relates to people in certain ways. I remember I had a communication once with the poet Lawson Fusawinada, and he's talking about his love of Billie Holiday and how jazz as kind of a medium is not just as a popular music form, but it's also a cultural connection as well that differentiates, like bebop in particular, that this was the underground form of music. This was the music that resonated a lot, especially with communities of color, that stood out against, the mainstream, Glenn Miller kinds of popular swing that was more popular with white audiences. And so seeing how music music resonates with different individuals and communities in general, I think serves as a great medium. I write a little bit about jazz as well, not in this book, and I'm happy that actually the National Japanese American Historical Society has some photos of Paul Higaki, who played with Lionel Hampton, who I've written about a little bit. But as part of the question as well, and this comes out a lot in Greg's section on Japanese Americans in Europe, how many Japanese Americans who found these separate careers outside the United States found it in Europe through performing arts or arts. I mean, everyone who is familiar with, of course, Minnie Okubo's career starts out doing art classes. I think she learns art in Switzerland, for example, that she has this very transnational career before the war. And it comes out, again, with all these different artists, or these sopranos that Greg writes about, and how they're able to form careers that they would have maybe not had as much in the United States, because they're able to go on to the different operatic circuits or the classical music circuits. So not only is it just because, I mean, we both love classical music, we both have an affinity for it, or we both love it, but we also find ways in which that can serve as a great starting point for understanding broader historical trends. You can elaborate further on that, Greg.
I think that Jonathan said it very well. I would just add that, again, there's so much community support for classical music, both in terms of people buying records and welcoming, like Japanese tenors. There was Yoshi Fujiwara, who basically invented opera in Japan, supported himself by making tours of the United States and even sang in opera houses in places like Chicago. Tomatsu Muramaya is there's another Muramaya is another tenor, and there were Japanese sopranos like Hisi Koike and Miura is her name, who made careers of singing Madame Butterfly. And were enormously popular. But I think that it's more Koji, you said very correctly that George Yoshida has told the story about jazz. Now, there is Mari Yoshihara's Musicians from a Different Shore, but the full story of the importance of classical music in Japanese American communities has really not been told. And of course, being in Montreal, when all those years Kent Nagano was the director of the Montreal Symphony Orchestra, people would ask, how is it that a Japanese would be interested in classical music? And I would say a Japanese American has every reason historically to be interested in classical music.
That's great. Now, Greg, this is really the third in a series of books that you've written, collecting these stories together from the unsung great to the great unknowns, and now the unknown great. And I think what really sets this section, this new volume apart is both the new directions it takes your columns in, but also the co-authoring. Can you talk a little bit, and Jonathan as well, on how the process of co-authoring these articles and chapters, when and how did it impact your thinking and approach to these topics?
Well, I would say you're absolutely right that first the themes are different. What I talk about here a lot is Japanese American encounters with different minority religious groups, whether it's the Mennonites or the Mormons, that is the Latter-day Saints, or Catholics, and the very meaningful connections that Japanese Americans forge with these different groups. Sometimes they become converts, some not, but they're very much influenced and shaped by those connections. For example, Mike Masaoka, who is a convert to the Latter-day Saints, goes up and down the old Mormon trails in the Intermountain West, founding JACL chapters in the years before Pearl Harbor, and then in the months and years. And then when Pearl Harbor comes and Japanese Americans are moved away from the West Coast, all of the JACL chapters on the West Coast fold. So the only JACL chapters that are still working are those in the Intermountain West, and they provide the financing for the JACL to move to Salt Lake City, which Masaoka again arranges through the LDS Church, and Senator Albert Thomas, who was a Latter-day Saint, who was his mentor, and that's how they fund the Pacific Citizen. So that Mormon connection is extraordinarily important for the JACL and for Japanese Americans generally. Now, I have been doing collaboration ever since I I started in this field. In fact, my first collaborator was Peter Eisenstadt, and then where I worked with on African American history, and then I collaborated with my late mother on a pair of articles, and I got to notice the thrill of collaboration. And then I collaborated with Eric Muller on the series of blog posts attacking Michelle Malkin for her purported defensive internment, and so that's what actually got me into doing columns. The difference is, as Jonathan said, this is the fruit of COVID. This book is the child of COVID, when both because I was isolated north of the border and because I was wrestling with different demons, it was very hard for me to be able to write. And so luckily I could write columns with the accumulated information I had, plus the what I could find online. But even more, I was energized by collaboration, both with Jonathan, and particularly with Jonathan, and I pay full tribute to him, but also the various other collaborators I worked with, Mathieu Langlois and James Sun. It was fun to work with young historians. I mean, historians my age, I never was much interested in working with. I know what they do. It's people like Frank Abe who bring me something new, and Floyd Chung, and yeah. It was a very fruitful collaboration with Frank Abe on the John Okada book and things that came out of that. And even though Frank and Floyd put the Penguin anthology together on their own, we still maintained our intellectual correspondence and our intellectual companionship. But I think that the process of collaboration was very essential for me, both in inspiring me to work, bringing me new points of view, and just energizing me, encouraging me to find other things, like when Jonathan brought me different ideas in writing about music, or I think that it was Jonathan who suggested the Bunji Omura column that we did, that's published in there.
I mean, is this on?
Yeah. Hello?
Yeah, maybe I'll just borrow this real quick. Thanks, Kochi. I mean, to follow up on that, and it's hard to, I think you put it so well, Greg. And I think one thing I want to say is it really attests to, Greg's generosity as a scholar and also as an individual. Because, as you might know in academia, that often most people work by themselves. It's not like in other fields where everyone's collaborating 5 to 6 people on an article or project. It's a very solitary and kind of isolated sort of process a lot with writing, that we're all working on our own projects and everything. And that's fine, but one thing that I was really moved by is when Greg first invited me to work on a piece together, and I thought, I started as a young writer, and I wasn't, I was kind of still finding my voice as a writer, and working with him, it showed me this is how a senior scholar works with this writing process, and also the fact that he gave encouraging remarks, but also that, he treated me as an equal in the writing process, and that's something that, really attests to Greg's character as a great person, and also that he supports a lot of young scholars as well. He's not the only person to do this, but it's very rare, I think, in academia and in writing in general. So it's often it's humbling and an honor to work with them all the time. So, and in terms of with our writing process, we'll go back and forth. One of us will start a draft, and we usually try to take turns and say, okay, you take the draft first, and then I'll take the draft next time, and then we'll cover, okay, you get these archives here, you cover the Nichi Bei or the Rafa, and I'll get these other archives here. And so it's kind of a process where we learn from each other about how we look through an archive, what are the details that we're keeping our eyes out on when we're coming through, and it's like, okay, this is a part of the story that we should look out for in this person's life. And as you've noticed, as you might note with the book, is that a good chunk of the book is biographies. Something that I think we both enjoyed over the years is the process of writing biography, because not only do you get a really intimate sense of who a person is, unless you interview the person, it's really hard to get 100% an understanding of who that person was, especially if they're from the late 19th, early 20th century. But it really gives you a view of their world and what they went through, and also just an appreciation for their contributions. So I think that's something that's been a great byproduct of the collaborative process, is how we understand people and how we go about that in the writing process. So.
I should interpose that Koji is much too modest about his role in helping me, because he was a Stanford University student and so had access to the Hoji Shimbun database, even the parts of it that are closed to the public. And he many times sent me PDFs of articles that I needed.
It was always a pleasure to help with your brilliant writing, Greg. We're running up against time, so we have time for about one question from the audience. Does anybody in the audience have a question for either Greg or Jonathan? Well, then I'll go straight in to ask to wrap this up. What are you working on? Where are you heading next in your research, so we can get a little preview of what to expect and maybe a fourth volume or your next publications coming out? Greg?
Well, I'm still working on a book about the history of transnational contacts between Japan and Louisiana. And Jonathan and I and Mathieu Langlois are engaged in a study of Japanese Americans and Canadians and the Catholic Church. But the next volume that's likely to come out is, which is tentatively entitled Striking Camp, is a book of essays on the intersection between Japanese American history and LGBTQ history. The coverage of LGBTQ issues in the Japanese American press, writers who have written queer stories in Japanese American press or in the Japanese Canadian press, the origins of Asian American gay activism among Japanese Americans in the San Francisco Bay Area, and other topics. It's really, again, a hidden area of history that it's very exciting to uncover.
Yeah. Oh, is this working? Okay, good. Just to follow up on that, with Striking Camp, you can get a little taste of that in The Unknown Great. We have a small section on Randy Kikukawa, who was a queer activist in the 1980s here in San Francisco, and was very crucial in leading and fighting against discrimination in the gay bars here in San Francisco in the 80s. And so that's one story that we'll expand upon in Striking Camp, among several others, like on coverage of Lavender Godzilla, which is this queer publication within, more broadly Asian American, but a lot specifically within the Japanese American community. Can I ask a question? Or are we out of time?
We're basically out of time.
Okay,
so.
well, I'll skip it then. Okay.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading all those new books as they come out. It was a pleasure to read The Unknown Great, and I can't wait to see the next works. So let's all give a hand to Jonathan Van Harmelen and Greg Robinson.